Critical operation from Ukraine. The sabotage in Zaporizhia could cause a very big problem. The Russian army is in complete trouble with this move. Tens of thousands of Russians are forcibly evacuating the region. With this retreat, Ukraine's ingenious plan worked, but Putin's response was very heavy. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army started to take different steps. The moves in Zaporizhia were an important example. Russia seized this region shortly after the start of the war and continued its stable rule until recently as part of its assimilation and deterrence policies in the region. It started to send Ukrainians to the interior of Russia by forcibly issuing them passports while settling Russians in the evacuated areas. With the confidence in the predominance of civilians in this region, putting all ammunition depots in this region. But the Ukrainian army's plan in this region completely cornered Putin. The Ukrainians who were aware of the ammunition put in this region immediately took action after realizing that the Russian army needed such ammunition on the near front lines. The Ukrainian army contacted the Ukrainians in Zaporizhia. Putin was reluctant to engage in a hot conflict because of the nuclear power plant in this region. The Ukrainian army came up with an ingenious plan to evacuate the Russians in that region and to completely eliminate the need for ammunition nearby. For this, the Ukrainians in the region had to organize a massive sabotage. The Ukrainians in this region began to gather information near the nuclear power plant, posing as Russians when they realized that they needed some nuclear leakage to alarm Russia. They immediately began the operation. The Ukrainians started a mysterious fire in one of the energy storage centers inside the nuclear power plant. This immediately alarmed the scientists at the nuclear power plant, and the Kremlin was notified to evacuate the area for safety reasons. But Putin was adamant about staying in the area. He delayed the evacuation of the area, keeping the people of Zaporizhia in the dark. At the same time, the Ukrainian army launched an operation in the region, leaving the governor in control of the region at a loss as to what to do. He sent a message to the Kremlin again, but the response he received stunned the whole world. The Ukrainian army started to attack near the nuclear power plant. The aim of the small-scale attacks was to create Russians who were afraid of a nuclear explosion and a second Chernobyl in this area. The Ukrainian army has been quite successful. When the governor became worried about the future of the people in this region, he mobilized all the means at his disposal and began to evacuate the Russians immediately. The Ukrainians in the area were left to their fate. So Ukraine's plan worked exactly right. The Ukrainian army moved towards the ammunition depots they had identified in preparation for the operation before the confusion became clear. Ukrainian soldiers prepared ammunition trucks in nearby location and started to transport all the ammunition in this area to be transferred to their inventory. But at this very moment, the governor of Zaporizhia received a stern warning from the Kremlin, and the Russian army was ordered to return to its duties to protect both the ammunition depot and the nuclear reactors. The Ukrainian army learned about this through the radios, made an ingenious move, and thanks to this, the Russian army would suffer its heaviest defeat in Zaporizhia. The Ukrainian army learned through satellite images that a large group of Russian troops were heading towards Zaporizhia. In addition to the ammunition they could carry, the Ukrainian army deployed directors to nearby airports to provide reinforcement to this region. This move was recorded as the move that would enable Ukraine to win the war. When the Russian soldiers arrived at the ammunition depot, they found that it had been completely emptied. This caused a lot of anger, especially in the Kremlin, and the order from the top commanders to go on the offensive made things even more complicated. The Ukrainian army waited on the road to the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. Meanwhile, timer bombs left inside the Russian ammunition depot exploded. The Russian army began to panic. However, the Kremlin's first attack on Ukraine forced the demoralized Russians to attack forcefully with the necessary intelligence and equipment left behind. The Russian army was not in a position to inflict much damage when the Ukrainian army realized that the Russians were approaching the area. They waited for them to come to the right spot after the Russians entered the area. Ukrainian soldiers put the Russian army in a crossfire. With this, some of the already panicked Russian army began to flee back. The Ukrainian army took advantage of this huge advantage and went on the offensive. And they continued their offensive until every single Russian soldier at this point surrendered. While the Russian army was retreating, and the Ukrainian side was about to be put in a difficult situation by calling for help in this region, the drones that Ukraine had at the nearby airport were mobilized towards this region, and the Russian troops coming towards the area were intimidated by the bombardment. The Ukrainian army, with the damage it had inflicted and the ammunition it had stockpiled, moved back towards Ukraine. The cost of this event was very heavy for Russia. Not only did Russia lose control of Zaporizhia, but also a large amount of ammunition unintentionally ended up in Ukraine. These complications and troubles significantly increased the dominance of the Ukrainian army. But Putin immediately moved to avenge this operation. Putin has moved to use one of the many trump cards at his disposal. Putin, who thought that the Russian army had achieved victory only because of the support given to Ukraine, immediately made a final move and signed a decision that will be discussed all over the world. Russia decided to send some of its nuclear weapons to Belarus in order to utilize Belarus's regional potential. This decision would actually enable Russia to threaten Europe very easily. The main reason for this move was that Putin wanted to deter the countries supporting Ukraine. But this move seriously backfired, and many European countries realized that Ukraine was the last line of defense against Russia. With Russia making things more complicated with such moves, a very critical move came from Poland. The fighter jets, which are considered to be the biggest need of Ukraine, will be provided by Poland. Poland is one of the countries that has been supporting Ukraine the most since the beginning of the war. The most important reason for this is that Poland will be in second place in a possible successful invasion scenario by Russia. Aware of this, Poland mobilized all the means at its disposal and gave very serious support to Ukraine against Putin, especially its heroic stance on layup made the whole world support Ukraine with tanks. This step with fighter jets also paved the way for Ukraine to take steps to stop Putin. If the Russian military continues like this, it will face a major crisis, especially if the US decides to provide the F-16s requested by Ukraine. Things will take a very different turn. But Putin's intelligence data has begun to predict that Ukraine will soon have access to Ukrainian fighter jets. These predictions led Putin to make a very critical move. Russia's failure to take adequate security measures because the war has so far been entirely within Ukraine's borders has resulted in the deployment of air defense systems on every street in Moscow. This shows that the Kremlin is considering the possibility of Ukraine moving to confront Russia with airstrikes in the near future. But the Kremlin has a much bigger problem to deal with first. In his recent victory speech, Putin showed the world for the first time that he does not underestimate war. Back-to-back defeats have changed Putin from the man who said he would take Ukraine in 2 weeks to the man who said Russia's future depended on this war. Because of such developments, it is estimated that Putin now prioritizes his own political survival. This shows the whole world that if Putin loses this war, it is only a matter of time before he resigns due to the troubles people experience. The Ukrainian army has made history by capturing thousands of Russian soldiers in an unbelievable operation in Bakhmut, Ukraine, which has achieved one of the biggest victories since the beginning of the war, has received appreciation from all over the world. Upon all these developments, the threats coming from Vladimir Putin caused a great chaos. The Russian leader once again threatened the whole world. The Russian army is now struggling to hold on to many of the territories that it managed to dominate in Ukraine in the early days of the war. The Russian army, which did not think that the Ukrainian army could stand against it so strongly, was in a very relaxed state after its victories. Russia thought that Ukraine, which it attacked for no apparent reason, would surrender to its fate, and that it would only take a few months to capture these lands. But the Ukrainian army, which managed to get back on its feet after its defeats, came back much stronger than expected. In this way, there have been no new developments for months in many regions that Russia thought it could easily seize. In particular, the Russian army, unable to break through the defenses and strategic areas, failed in their plans to advance on Kiev in a few weeks. But the Ukrainian army came up with an ingenious idea to turn the underestimation of its strength to its advantage. The Ukrainian army gave the impression that it was withdrawing from the region so that the Russian troops would not feel threatened. The Ukrainian army's use of this tactic, especially in strategic areas such as Bakhmut and Soledar, made the Russian troops think that they were in complete control. The Russian army, which had minimized its defenses, was in a state of caution. The Ukrainian troops who managed to bring the conditions to the desired level started to organize their attacks on the Bakhmut and Slardar regions, shocking the Russian soldiers. Russia, which did not expect any attack in these regions, was caught quite unprepared. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, had planned a detailed operation to completely expel Russia from these regions. The Ukrainian intelligence service, which took action to break the resistance in Soledar and Bakhmut to a great extent, carried out a detailed sweep in the region. During these scans, it was seen that the Russian troops stationed in the region, despite their large numbers, lacked the weaponry to meet a major attack. All the armament of the Russian soldiers was located behind the front lines. The defense units in the region did not have sufficient strength. Russia was unaware that it would once again pay a heavy price for underestimating the power of the Ukrainian army. Due to this lack of caution, according to this plan, the Ukrainian army's primary objective would be to create a diversion. At first, the Ukrainian army would launch a smaller attack, which would give the Russian army the opportunity to attack from the opposite direction. The fact that the Wagner mercenaries were far from the front line also worked in favor of the Ukrainian troops. Having obtained all the information, the Ukrainian army surprised the Russian troops by launching its first attack. After the attack came the Russian soldiers who were deployed in the wrong direction so that the Ukrainian troops were very few and counterattacked. But it was at this moment that the Ukrainian army began its real offensive. The Ukrainian army advancing on the front that the Russian soldiers had left unattended, surrounded the front. The Russian troops who had no access to any necessary equipment and whose armament was quite inadequate, were left with their hands tied as much as the Russian soldiers wanted to engage in combat. They realized that the first moment that there could be no mutual confrontation. Realizing that they could not stand against the Ukrainian army, which entered the area with tanks and high-powered firepower, the Russian soldiers fell into great despair. Left with no other choice against the Ukrainian army, which attacked from both sides of the front, the Russian soldiers were forced to surrender one by one. The Ukrainian army, which has achieved incredible successes in recent days, has officially made history with this victory. The biggest success in this attack was the capture of about 10,000 Russian soldiers by the Ukrainian army. After all that happened in the Bakhmut region, the Ukrainian army, which took action to carry out a similar strike in Soledar so that the Russian troops in this region had withdrawn to other regions. Although this withdrawal was seen as a setback for the big strike, the Ukrainian army managed to achieve great success in this region as well. But the attack on the small number of Russian troops in the region, the Ukrainian army managed to take the Russian soldiers here as prisoners. After repeated defeats of the Russian army, Russian leader Vladimir Putin has once again been humiliated in front of the eyes of the whole world. After this, he has now quite openly voiced the threat of nuclear weapons, which he has been trying to bring to the agenda for a long time. If these threats of Vladimir Putin, who is known to make impulsive decisions in shame and anger, come to life, all world peace will be endangered. The constant outbreak of new wars in the world affects the peace of all countries. For this reason, countries that want the Russian threat to disappear as soon as possible have increased their support for Ukraine, both in the hot battlefields and in world politics. Many states are taking a pro-Ukrainian stance. In addition, states that have had close relations with Russia for many years are known to have withdrawn all their support for Putin with this war. Many of our analysts believe that Russia and therefore Vladimir Putin will leave this war with great damage. Putin's heavy rhetoric also proves these doubts, especially the recent decisions of the G7 countries have increased the pressure on Putin. The G7 countries will not only support Ukraine, but will also increase their pressure on Russia. Russia's political relations with many countries have deteriorated during this war, while trade agreements have also been disrupted since it was not possible for countries that are interconnected in many ways to terminate these agreements at once. They cause some disruptions, with countries like North Korea and Japan siding with Ukraine. In this war, the Russian front became more and more complicated. Not only has all support been cut off, but the Russian government can no longer even get the weapons it wants. The ammunition they have been trying to procure from other countries has been blocked, and that defeats they are suffering are increasing day by day. One of the biggest factors in recent developments, Japan's involvement in this war has brought the claims of World War III back to the agenda. As it is known, many countries reacted to America, which has been over-intervening since the beginning of the war. The reason for this reaction was that America was more involved than necessary. For this reason, Japan's provision of weapons that can be used not only in defense but also in attack like the United States created controversy with the current level of technology. In the event of a world war, no country will be to overcome the effects of this war for many years. On the other hand, Russia has to deal not only with foreign policy, but also with internal problems. Putin, who has completely lost control of his people, is on the home stretch. The protests around the Kremlin have gotten out of hand. The people believe that Putin must be removed from power as soon as possible and are doing everything they can to achieve this goal. Nevertheless, Putin, who will not relinquish his throne as he has been sitting on for years under any circumstances, is becoming more and more dictatorial towards the people. Some statements are as effective as missiles blowing up the most important headquarters. In particular, the statements and confessions of those who have witnessed the events on the battlefield can have the power of discrediting countries and armies. A statement made the other day destroyed the diminishing reputation of the Russian army. Andrei Medvedev, who served as a commander with the Wagner Group, a private military company but resigned from his post due to lawlessness and corruption, made a striking statement the other day. Medvedev left the Wagner Group in late July 2022 and defected from Russia in January 2023, seeking asylum in Norway. Medvedev's statements drop like a bomb on Russia's agenda. Former Wagner Group official Andrei Medvedev made statements to an American media organization. Medvedev announced that Russian soldiers who refused to serve in the occupied territories were killed. Medvedev said that soldiers who did not want to fight against Ukraine were shot and thrown into graves in front of the eyes of the soldiers who had just joined the front. The Russian military may be ruthlessly trying to solve its problems, such as the lack of military personnel to serve in the occupied territories. The many soldiers leaving the front are surrendering to Ukrainian troops and the increasing casualties, as Medvedev says. Because before this statement of Medvedev, the statements of Russian soldiers who were captured by Ukraine or surrendered to the Ukrainian troops and left the front describing the atrocities in the Russian army came to the fore. The phone calls of Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine were leaked recently. The most striking of these conversations was what a Russian soldier named Sergei said while talking to his girlfriend. Sergei said that Russian army ordered the soldiers to kill hundreds of civilians in the city of Bucha. Sergei told his girlfriend, "They told us that there were a lot of civilians walking around where we were going, and they ordered us to kill everyone we saw." In total, Ukrainian intelligence intercepted 22 phone calls revealing that the inhuman orders and practices of the Russian army were criticized by soldiers within the army. The handful of Russian soldiers held by the Russian army are kept in the army with threats. One thing is constantly on their minds: to leave the front line or surrender to Ukrainian troops. Russian soldiers are waiting for the right moment to make this happen. In recent months, a media outlet reported that Russian soldiers had injured themselves in order to escape the war. The soldiers' statements confirm this claim. In one of the leaked phone calls, a Russian air assault soldier says to his girlfriend, "I had a commander who shot himself in the leg just to get out of here." Soldiers who were able to escape from the Russian army continue to report the inhuman practices of the army in their statements. One of them is Nikita Chibrin, who escaped from the Russian occupiers and fled to Europe via Belarus and Kazakhstan. Describing the brutality within the Russian army, Chibrin says that in the 64th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade where he served, there were maniacs who enjoyed killing people and rapes. Chibrin also said that Russian invaders broke into homes of Ukrainian civilians and looted items such as jewelry, computers, and phones. He said the occupiers sold the stolen items in Belarus. Many soldiers serving in the Russian army say it is not right to fight Ukraine. They say that Russian soldiers are unaware of the operations they are carrying out, and the reason they are in Russian paratrooper commando. Pavel Filatyev, who questioned all these and published his thoughts in a 141-page book, reveals almost all the crimes of the Russian army in his writings. Filatyev explained that the reason for writing these confessions as follows: "I am not afraid to fight in war, but I need to feel justice to realize that what I did was right. And I believe that all this is failing not only because the government is stealing everything, but because the Russians don't feel that what we are doing is right. Why do we need this war? And I really thought, God, If I survive, I will do everything in my power to stop this. Pavel Felicia was wounded in the eye by a shell explosion and left the army saying that he could not fight like that. Filatyev, who left Russia immediately after leaving the Russian army, began to describe all the barbarities he witnessed during the war. Filatyev also described the difficult conditions Russian soldiers were living in. He said that the authorities in the army did not care about the hardships of Russian soldiers. Filatyev said that he could bathe only once for 2 months and did not eat bread for a month and a half. Filatyev also made striking statements about the equipment in the Russian army. It has long been stated that the equipment destroyed in the war cells was left over from the Soviet-Russian era and was insufficient against the Ukrainian army. Filatyev talked about a development he experienced on this issue. He said that when Russia launched its invasion attempt in Ukraine, weapons were distributed to the soldiers in the army. However, he stated that these weapons were rusted and a strap was broken. Filatov's writings revealed many facts that the Russian army is trying to conceal and the inhumanity of its actions in the war zones. In a report containing the statements of soldiers who surrendered to Ukrainian troops or escaped from the front, a Russian soldier openly expressed all the inhuman acts he committed in the war. Here are the confessions of the Russian occupier. I, Daniel Andreevich Fokin of the Guard Corps, a soldier of Military Unit 5460, confessed to all the crimes are committed in Andreevka, shooting civilians, stealing from civilians, and taking their phones. Then our fighters, all the infantry fighting on the front line. While the Russian army is suffering a setback on the front line with the losses it suffered against Ukraine, it is also losing credibility with the confessions of Russian soldiers who surrendered after these confessions. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is seen as a ruthless person by the whole world. Putin is aware of all the developments confessed by the surrendered soldiers, but he ignores them because Putin cannot even find soldiers to fight. Almost all the soldiers in the Russian army do not want to take part in the invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, Putin, who cannot find soldiers, mostly deploys mercenaries belonging to the Wagner Group and Chechens loyal to Kadyrov in the occupation zones. This means that untrained and ruthless people are being deployed on the front lines. The atrocities committed by the Wagner Group during the occupation are known to the whole world. Last week, the United States declared the Wagner Group an international criminal organization. This company is headed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, one of the closest friends of Russian leader Putin. The whole world sees Putin and his friend as wrong. It is predicted that Russia will have big problems even if the war ends with dwindling ammunition, surrendered soldiers, and declining reputation.